So here's our next topic. Should students in school be learning about anti-racism and white privilege? A piece in the Toronto Star says that while the recent focus has been on safely reopening schools, school boards should also prioritize anti-racism courses for staff and for students. The writer argues that the anxiety that young people feel because of racism makes this a health crisis. So what are your thoughts on providing anti-racism training in Canadian schools and how and when it should be taught?
I think that when we say anti-racism, if we mean teaching kids about racism and its effects in society, I think that's important to do at a young age. I remember I was in grade 3. I was 8 years old when I remember really seeing something that I thought was racism when my father was being berated by police officers. And it would have been really helpful for me as a kid to be able to go to school the next day and talk about that experience with a teacher and learn about what that meant and why that's important for people to understand and why that experience is not unique to my father, but is a bigger thing in our society. But there's also a difference, in my view, between talking about racism and how it affects people and teaching things like white privilege. In my mind, what we want to be teaching kids is the problem of generalizing people based on their skin color. And I think if you're too young and you're taught white privilege by some people, it might lead to generalizing people in a completely different way. And those sorts of ideas, I think, are more suitable when you're older and you can have a more critical conversation about how identity works in our society.
I want to say that Blaze was probably 4 years old when she was told that she wasn't invited to a birthday party because of her black skin. Kids learn real early, and it isn't always at home that they learn it. They learn it outside, and it isn't always parents that have to teach it. It's teachers and others. My dad was a longtime educator, and what I learned from him was that it's about inclusivity, it's about diversity, it's about anti-racism all the time. So in his schools, February wasn't the only month that kids learned Black history. He was in a school that was a mostly diverse school, mostly Black school, yes, but he made sure that those kids saw themselves all the time. And I think it's how you teach it. He had books in the library. He had posters on the wall. He tried to have as diverse a staff as possible. I don't think you have to say to kids, we're teaching you about white privilege today. You do it in a different way. You introduce books that show everybody. You introduce lesson plans that include everybody. What we're really talking about is a systemic problem here, and the system itself has to change.
Yes, I agree with Marcian. I think teaching institutional racism is what we should be doing, and really looking at. As an Afro-Indigenous woman, I grew up having privileges around my Indigenous identity because I am an appearing Black woman. I remember being at Safeway one time, and my mom, a store clerk coming to my mom and being like, you have to pay for that. And me having to intervene and my voice being heard way before my mother's because she's an Indigenous woman. So I like Jamil, I wish I had a place to have that conversation with teachers, with the mentors around me, to be able to decipher what was happening around me.
Yeah,
I have.
Go ahead, Jamil.
Oh, I absolutely agree that this is something that should be integrated into our education system broadly. And I think ultimately what we need to understand and make a decision about collectively in our society is what are the values we want to present to our young people? Are we teaching them that we should be using race to look at one another and filter how we perceive one another's behavior and ideas? Or are we teaching them that we shouldn't be using race at all when we assess one another's value or our friendships or our cultural connections with one another? I think it's a really complicated thing. And Marcy's example of how her father integrated those complicated conversations into the very experience of being a student, I think that's very telling for a lot of us to think about how our schools should operate in our communities.
Yeah, I agree in terms of integrating and correcting the lack of education that we had. I mean, when I was going to school, the history that we got was, I'm sure you are all familiar with it, was, hey, the Europeans came over and everybody was nice to each other and traded goods, and it was nice. And it was not nice. It was colonization. And if you accurately present history from a framework of what actually happened, which is people colonized other people and took things away from them, then you start to build a foundation for naming it later on when they're older, as you said, Jamil, and introducing bigger concepts. But if they have the facts right to begin with, where they can see that there was all this unfairness that happened in the history books accurately, then I think you can start building on that. I think one thing for me is that growing up in Canada, when I look back at the things that we were taught, it's just so outrageous that it was presented to us like that.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's what I mean. It's systemic. We have to look at how our kids are being taught and what they're being taught, and get more creative and more accurate with it. That is for sure. But it's also about, being comfortable. And a lot of this stems from people being uncomfortable talking about race, talking about color. And we've got to continue to push and continue to go there. And I will say our kids are a lot smarter than we think, and they learn a lot sooner than we think.